Please welcome our host, Tom Spohr, Director of the Heritage Foundation Center for Defense.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tom Spohr. I'd like to welcome you to our event, The State of Decision Support Analysis in the DOD. And while this is certainly a very important topic, it is nowhere near as important as what's taking place in Ukraine today. And I thought it'd be appropriate to pause for a moment, think about that tragic war, and how our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainians at this moment. And I think we have a slide on that. So just a small thing, but this is the Heritage Foundation building, and up at the top, if you squint, you can see that next to the American flag, we're flying the Ukrainian flag today. And so our thoughts and prayers are with them. So now on to our event. What size, what posture, warfighting concepts, and equipment should the United States military have to defend our national interests? The Department of Defense makes these decisions every day, and made incorrectly, these choices can cost U.S. service members their lives or America a war. And while intuition can play a role for the best chance of success, such decisions must be supported by data and analysis. Yet, in 2018, the National Defense Strategy Commission found that DOD struggled to link objectives to operational concepts, to capabilities, to programs and resources, and blamed this on a deficit in analytical capability, expertise, and processes. A shortfall in DOD analytic capability should be a concern to all Americans. Well, to discuss this critical capability, this afternoon we have an outstanding group of leaders and experts to provide their insights. Each of these leaders has sat at the table when such decisions have been made about what equipment DOD should buy, what's the kinds of forces they should maintain, and what type of strategy or force posture the U.S. military should adopt. And as they say, they have been there and done that. Secretary David Norquist, to my immediate left, served as Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2019 to 2021, and before then as an Undersecretary of Defense for Comptroller for 2 years. He has a distinguished record of public service spanning 3 decades in multiple key positions. Secretary John Whitley, similarly, has had a great record of public service. Most recently, he served as Acting Secretary of the Army. Before that, he served from 2019 to 2020 as the Acting Director of OSD's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Directorate, otherwise known as CAPE, and before that as the Army's Chief Financial Officer. And finally, Dr. Thomas Mencken is the President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a leading DC think tank deeply engaged in defense analysis. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning, has served on multiple Blue Ribbon Defense Commissions and panels, and is a noted author. So we have a great panel to delve into this issue. Our plan is for me to pose some questions to them for a few minutes, and then after that, we are going to turn to the questions that you, as the audience, send to us through the web application you're viewing this program through. So I would encourage you to find the link, find the button that says submit a question, and submit it to us. It'll come right to us here in this auditorium, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. So that, with our backdrop, let's get started. Secretary Norquist, to you first, sir. During your time as Undersecretary of Defense for Comptroller and then as Deputy Secretary of Defense, what was your sense of the state of analytical analysis that supported the major acquisition and force structure decisions confronting the DOD? Did you feel as if you had the necessary analysis to support decision-making that involved investments of billions of dollars? And do any examples come to mind, good and bad, that you could share?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting, Tom, this important event and discuss this topic. As some of the studies pointed out, when we first came in, the effective sequestration had been to attrit many of the analytical capabilities of the Department of Defense. And so there was a weakness there in a number of areas, and over the several years we added additional resources to be able to try and get that back into the place it needed to be. You know, one of the things that I would just highlight as an example of how effectively the analytical support really worked in the Department of Defense is what we called SPEARS, and I'll let John explain the acronym since I just always use the word SPEARS instead.
Strategic Portfolio Review.
Strategic Portfolio Review. We always have to have acronyms in DOD, and then we reuse them. And so this was one that had a lot of the strengths that you need to make analysis work well. So what we do is at the end of one year, we would look ahead while we are still 6 or more months out and ask the question, what are going to be the real issues we're going to have to wrestle with in this next budget program cycle when we're looking out 5 years? What are the real challenges? And I'd sit down with John and his team and we'd say, okay, what's the analysis that we need in order to be able to make those decisions at that time? What's the information we're going to want then? So part of it is you had really well thought out questions because we'd spend some time wrestling with them to make sure we said them correctly, that we're getting the right thing. Enough time to do the analysis, and then timing the analysis to show up when the decision makers were most going to need it in order to make a decision. And that sort of alignment can be very tricky. But when you have that, then when we're sitting down making very significant, expensive decisions, we've got the trade-off between the capabilities of either different platforms and munitions or risk assessment or understanding of the requirements. So I found that to be a particularly effective part of the process and one that I relied on consistently when I was Deputy Secretary. And it was very useful in really helping everyone in leadership make informed decisions. I was more concerned over the long-term force structure type of choices. We didn't seem to have the same sort of robustness that we had. I'll just use an example. In my last year, I worked on the Future Naval Forces Study, which was a spin-off of the Navy had traditionally done a 30-year shipbuilding plan. But in the 30-year shipbuilding plan, they tend to only look out 5 to 10 years, lock down what the Navy should look like in that, and then the last 20 years were a flatline projection. But if you realize how long a Navy ships last, 10 years from now, your Navy looks overwhelmingly like it does right now. You can only make the next 10 years, 5 to 10 years with the ships with the shipyards you have and the capacity you have now. So inevitably, this study, even when done by conscientious, intelligent, rational people, produced a budget and a 30-year plan that looked almost exactly like the current force structure. And so when we looked at that, and Secretary at the time was very concerned about that, we moved further out the date at which we would lock the structure. It gets harder. The further out you go, the harder it is to understand what the opposition may bring, so you have to be much more tolerant of the range of missions. But you can envision platforms that didn't exist. You can envision quantities that the current shipyards couldn't produce. You could make trades in that space. Navy and Marine Corps were a central part of that mission and that function. The Joint Staff and CAPE came in, and we did that analysis again over multiple months, aligned to arrive with the same time as we were locking down that fiscal year's budget. And that was really helpful, but it did require, from my position as Deputy Secretary, a sustained focus on this one topic. And I really think that's an area where, looking into the future, you'd want to be able to have these types of force structure things done on a more routine basis that doesn't require that much. It doesn't require the Secretary to direct it and the Deputy to sort of manage and meet with everybody on it. So let me stop there. I know we got a lot of good questions coming, but there was some good, some bad, but a lot of it got better over time when we put some more resources on it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, Secretary Whitley, turning to you, you served as the Acting Director of Cost Analysis Program Evaluation, CAPE, the lead analytic organization in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I'm curious, what types of analysis were you responsible for producing? What was your sense of CAPE and the department's overall analytic capability? Were you satisfied with the analysis being done, and how well do you think it was supporting the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary's needs in decision making?
Well, that's great, Tom, and happy to talk about that. And thank you for having this session. Yeah, so CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, it really contributes or conducts 3 kind of broad categories of analysis. The first would be cost estimating. So that is primarily focused on acquisition programs and estimating the costs of acquisition programs. The second would be kind of program analysis. This would inform the planning, program, budgeting, execution system, the program review process. The strategic portfolio reviews would be part of this, although they tend to be a little more strategic at the strategic end of this, but really program evaluation, program analysis. And the third would be kind of the strategic analysis that I think you kind of led in, and what the NDS Commission found was a serious shortfall. So of those 3 broad categories of analysis at CAPE, and CAPE is organizationally aligned around those pillars: 1 deputate for cost, 2 deputates for program analysis, and 1 for the strategic analysis. Of those, the first 2, the cost and the program analysis, they're pretty mature, right? I mean, I think I think most people are familiar with them, what CAPE does in those roles. They produce results. The cost estimators produce results for each system, for each milestone coming up. The program review, that's a repeated process every year, and I think people are familiar with that, and those are very mature. They could certainly be improved on the margin. On the cost estimating side, acquisition costs, the direct procurement costs are pretty well estimated. The operations sustainment costs aren't. There's been a multi-year effort now to capture more data for ONS, for operations and sustainment, and I think that's an area that's going to be improving over the next few years. And that's becoming more important as we think about trying to accelerate the development timeline. We think about trying to move more things into the digital space, getting to understand the trade space between upfront development design, the acquisition and the manufacturing of the product, and the sustainment of the product is going to become more important. A second challenge with them on the methodological side is they're very wed, for good reasons, to using historic data from historic programs. That's good because you're trying to inject realism. The last time we did this, what did it actually look like? Not what might be the overly optimistic projections in the future. I think a fair criticism would be maybe they focus a little too much, though. And so when you have new things coming along, digital transformation, as a service buying, thinking about satellites and moving more into commercial types of satellites, there's a little bit of a bias against those things. So I think there's some areas for improvement there. But overall, very mature, very process. Program analysis, second area, again, very mature. David talked about the SPEARs. At the margins, David already talked about this. It's very good on weapon systems, less good on readiness, less good on force structure. So I think there's some areas to improve there. Methodologically, they almost have the opposite problem. They always look to the future, modeling and simulation, very reluctant, not a lot of strength at looking at realized performance data. That's going to become more important as the audit matures, as the data gets better, the department gets better data. So a little bit of room for improvement there. But again, very mature, established process. Where I think the biggest challenge is in CAPE is that strategic analysis. And this is, the ability to translate strategic direction, the national defense strategy, into its implications for force structure, posture, capability requirements, et cetera, and then to be able to bridge that down to the programming. If that phase isn't working, then the programmers are kind of working in the dark. So I think that's where we need the biggest improvement. We might talk throughout this session about what happened. David already talked about the sequester, and the process that was in place was kind of taken away, was eliminated 10 or so years ago. There's some strong efforts to rebuild it. I'm seeing very positive signs from some of the organizations involved in trying to get in front of these questions. But unfortunately, the state of play today is that's a significant gap in the department's capabilities.
Thank you very much. Excellent. And it's funny you mentioned the ONS cost, because the F-35 has moved past arguments about its acquisition costs, and now all the arguments are about its ONS cost. Dr. Mencken, so you've obviously had a very distinguished career working both in and outside of DOD, more probably time outside than some of our other panels here. And you were a member of the National Defense Strategy Commission, the actual commission that found shortcomings in DOD's ability to conduct analysis. And previously, you've been involved in conducting quadrennial defense reviews and national defense strategies. Now, in your role as the president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, you work very closely with DOD and often support their needs for analysis. I'm wondering, how have you seen the DOD's ability to conduct analysis change over time, and where do you think it stands today?
Well, first, Tom, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's wonderful to be able to share the stage with you and the other panelists. And thanks also for taking on this decidedly unsexy but vitally important topic. It's something that we don't talk about enough, and we should talk about more, because analysis is I'll say a potentially powerful lever, not just to inform decisions, but also to implement decisions. So I commend you for taking this on. Look, let me try to add to what my colleagues have already said, and put this into some perspective, which is, over the last 20 years, there have been two big shifts, strategic shifts, in the way the Defense Department plans and analyzes, right? So the first if we go back to just before, even just after 9/11, the focus was really on regional adversaries and regional threats. And so we had an analytical enterprise that was focused on regional conflicts. Think the Korean Peninsula, think Southwest Asia. Then 9/11 happened, and there was a whole reorientation of that enterprise towards the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the global war on terrorism, irregular warfare, and I was there for part of that shift, and that was a painful shift. And now, and I'd say starting particularly with the 2018 National Defense Strategy, there's an ongoing shift to great power competition and its corollary, which we're unfortunately seeing play out in Eastern Europe, which is great power conflict. And so, that analytical enterprise overlaid over BCA, sequester, the loss of talent, has been this conceptual shift. And it needs to occur. It should be occurring faster, but I also understand why it takes time to shift conceptually. So I'd say that's kind of ingredient number one. Ingredient number two is it's about 21st century warfare. We're out of the era where it was all about platforms. We're much more in an era where it's about networks and systems of systems. How do you really model and analyze those things? How do you value, how do you value connectivity, for example? How do you value new domains of warfare? I think that's a second challenge. The third challenge has already been mentioned, which is the loss of intellectual capital for various reasons. And then I think the fourth thing that I would highlight is the organizational dimension to it. And I was really picking up on Secretary Whitley's comment, which is traditionally the way to translate strategy, into analysis was through the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And not to be too parochial for my own organization, but that's the seat at the table that really ensures that analysis is serving as the instantiation of strategy and driving its implementation forward. And I think, unfortunately, across administrations, that role has been diminished, and I think ultimately to our not to the better.
Excellent. Just a quick follow-up on that. You talked about the loss of intellectual capital. And I know you're in the marketplace for DOD intellectual. I mean, do you see this in your current position that it is just hard to find the right people to do this kind of work?
Absolutely. And in the if you go back to the Cold War, there was a whole community of defense analysts and academic programs and various places inside, outside of government training up analysts. And we sort of lived off of that investment in intellectual capital for a long time afterwards. But a lot of that's gone away. People have retired. Really, world-class analysts are out of the game. So we need to rebuild, and not rebuild for Cold War 2.0, but rebuild for the 21st century. I think we do face a real talent deficit, and many of the places that in past decades would have supplied that talent they just aren't doing that anymore.
Thank you. So some more questions here. These are going to come a little quicker, and again, I invite our audience members to submit questions. Some of you are already doing so, and I thank you for that. So Secretary Norquist, I'll start with you, but then I would invite the other panelists to chime in with your thoughts. I'm curious, why is it so hard to conduct good analysis in the Pentagon? What are some of the complicating factors that inhibit, the ability to reach the right decisions?
So I'll start with, and then have the others join in. The first answer is good analysis anywhere is hard, right? When you actually talk about a quality analysis of looking at a difficult problem and finding an answer that others don't automatically see, you got to understand whether your assumptions are the right ones or the wrong ones. You've got to understand the whole issues of quality control and the quality of the data you're looking at. There are hidden biases, not in the sense of the person, but in terms of how you frame something or look at it. Most people have a challenge with statistics just generally, and the difference between correlation and causation and a lot of those things. So it's kind of like walking along the edge of a steep hill. It's really easy to fall down the hill, and it's really hard to stay going straight. Plus, you have to have leadership willing to engage and take action on the data you have. And so let me just pause there, and they can walk through some of the DOD specific ones. But my only first thought is this is hard wherever you try and do it, unless you have a system or organization that just is almost all they do, all the time.
I would just add to that, building on your comments, actually, it's hard to do, and then that where I think a lot of us think the biggest gap is that strategic integration, that strategic analysis piece. When your paradigms are changing, you're moving from a two major theater war construct where you've spent years kind of building an infrastructure to support that, then that shifts to a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. You spend years in that paradigm. So now, we have this new returning to near peer major adversary type of conflict. It simply it takes time, and you have to build an infrastructure to be able to analyze questions in that framework.
Yeah, good analysis is a craft. And I think if we go back and look, go back to the early Cold War, go back and look at the early nuclear era and a place like the Rand Corporation then, it was treated as a craft. And people took a long time to conceptualize an issue, to lay out assumptions, to figure out the best way to gain traction on the issue and then move forward. I think what happened progressively over time is that analysis has become kind of an industrial process. And maybe ironically, the more resources that we threw at analysis, the more kind of industrialized it became. So it's all about, it was all about, building all these models that took, legions of people to feed, kind of like, the first, boilers on ships. You needed all these people to shovel coal into the boiler to make the ship go. And over time, I think a lot of the thoughtfulness kind of just went away. And so I think what we need today is, is to go back to thinking about analysis as a craft. So, put it very starkly, if we are in an era defined by competition and potentially conflict with China and Russia, what are the types of analytical tools that we need to equip senior leaders to make decisions? We talk all about great power competition, but what are the analytical tools to actually look at that? We talk about shaping, imposing costs on adversaries. Okay, what are the tools that we have to actually measure our ability to impose costs on others, and quite frankly, the very real costs that they've imposed upon us?
Yeah, when you're talking about that, I was thinking about testimony we've heard from DOD officials when they come over to Congress and talk. And what you never hear is somebody like the Secretary of Defense or the Undersecretary of Policy will say something like, and our models and simulations and analysis reflects that if we do this, it will result in that. You never hear that. I mean, I know it's all classified, so we're never going to see the real stuff, but you just don't hear any kind of even hint that their decisions are being influenced by this kind of analytic basis. At least that's my sensing. Excellent. I guess, Secretary Whitley, I would ask you this question because it's almost I'm asking, or curious, how is strategic analysis currently organized at the department level? I know you left, but it hadn't been that long ago. And do you think it's working? Are the various players in this organization cooperating? Is it working well? And is this the best way that you think we are organized now? Is this the best way to organize our capabilities?
I think it's struggling right now. Yeah. So the by traditional I mean, post-Cold War, post-Goldwater Nichols kind of organization is there's really three key players at the departmental level, and that is policy, that is joint staff, and then is CAPE. They've been called the Three Amigos in the past. They've been called the TriChairs in the past. They've been called much worse than that as well.
Just not to their faces.
I certainly think you can find periods where productive work was being done and where progress was being made, but you can also find periods where it didn't work. It depends on personalities, and right now is what we've been talking about up here, all three of us. A lot of the tools aren't there. The tools aren't up to, and the human capital in some places is not up to doing that. So where we need to be. There's a lot of reasons why we're struggling right now. Secretary Norquist mentioned the sequester area. CAPE and policy both divested a significant amount of that capability as part of their contribution to sequester. Joint staff has had its own challenges. They've moved some of these functions from J8 to J7. It's very hard for a new organization, particularly an organization that's not, that doesn't have the regular, repeated battle rhythm and credibility and discipline that being part of the budget process that J8 has. It's hard for other offices to sometimes get to the level of somebody like the analytic folks at J8. So I think there's a lot of structural reasons and historical reasons why we're struggling right now. So I think fixing that, I don't know what all the answers are to fix that. I think that'll be an important element of the commission that the Defense Authorization Act has directed. I think that should be an important part of that, is trying to re-envision that process, get the right players, get the right organizations, get the right tools, get the right authorities in place to get that where it needs to be.
Let me, and for the other panelists here, so for me, I've always hated being like the co-chair or like a three co-chair kind of thing, whatever that's called, TriChair, I guess. And so my instinct as a military officer is to always put one person in charge of something, but that may not be appropriate. I'm just curious, should DOD have a single analytic center of excellence, or is this the right way and it just needs to be run properly?
So there's a part of the reason why you don't see that in DOD is the purpose of the analysis is not simply the report at the end. It is bringing along the players who have to all reach this. And if they don't trust the information, if they don't trust the report, to the extent that an outside entity comes back and says the answer is 7, everyone will just assume that, well, that's their position, and they'll all come up with their own. So when we did like the Future Naval Force study, when CAPE does some of the, we had the Navy, we had the Marine Corps, we had outside organizations, we had CAPE, we brought a whole bunch of them together so that they all saw the analysis, because part of that is it's the journey the analysis takes you on from what you don't know to what you learn, and then done right, people will all realize the same, not the same answer, but the same situation, the boundaries, the trade space. And that then you can have a conversation. But you actually need all of those organizations to come with you. And so my fear is if you took it out, they'd all recreate their own and then they'd use it to second guess the first one because they weren't part of the process.
Excellent point. I hadn't even thought of that, Dr.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and you know, I don't think I'm looking at the past through rose-colored glasses, but at least when I was part of that process, it worked very well, and I think the relationship I had with my dating myself, PA&E and joint staff counterparts was a very good, productive one. Didn't mean that each of us agreed with each other 100% of the time. But usually at least 2 of the 3 of us agreed, and then a lot can happen. But as Secretary Norquist says, I mean, ultimately it's about informing decision makers, and it is you're going to be much more helpful if you can get a lot of buy-in on the path to that decision. So
Excellent, thank you. So Secretary Norquist, I'm going to throw this one to you. This has been an issue that's in the press. It's not directly related to analytic capability, but on the other hand it is, and that is there is talk, writing about newly appointed civilian leaders in the Pentagon, political leaders in particular, and an extraordinary disadvantage when they show up in the Pentagon and all the people around them have been versed for years in all the various lore of the Pentagon. They know the analytic procedures, they know their advantages and disadvantages. They're facing off against officers in uniform who've been doing this for a living, and they're playing for keeps. Is that a real thing? And if so, what can be done to kind of better balance that?
So if you come into the Pentagon from outside, you had a background in commercial, et cetera, you bring with you a set of skills and exposures that other people don't have. But you also don't have an inside the building understanding. So you'd have that disadvantage. But you generally don't see an entire administration filled with outsiders, right? What you discover is they bring in a mix. And so, for example, I first worked in the Pentagon in '89 when there was still a Soviet Union and did programming and budgeting. And I have done that for 30 years. So when I'm in the building, I'm looking across people who arrived after I did, right, who don't remember some of the things I worked with or the people I worked with in multiple assignments. So what's necessary to be effective if you come from the outside is to make sure you have enough people with you who have been part of this process long enough to be able to explain, here's how you make happen what you're asking for. Here's the right office to lead it or to be part of the team. Here's the timeline you need to allow. And so I think if you have that mix, it can be very effective, which is why when you come into some place where you only know part of the puzzle, you need to surround yourself with the people who know the other parts.
Excellent. Any other panelists comment on this?
I would actually, without taking us too far afield, I'd actually broaden this out, because you have this framed in terms of, in this whole session, framed in terms of DOD, which I think is absolutely right. I would just say at this point, though, that in some ways, in a lot of ways, the system that we have in DOD is far better than the systems that many of our allies have. And so where, the problem that you pose here, a new political appointee, new political leadership comes in and is at the mercy of the public service and the military. To the extent that that may be an issue in our system, it is much more of an issue among many of our allies. And so when I talk about rebuilding intellectual capital, it applies doubly to many of our allies. That's just something that we should note as we move forward.
I got something for you, Dr. Mencken, and that has got to do with this idea of insourcing and outsourcing analysis for the Department of Defense. And I don't know, I don't have a long history of this, but I've seen recently a number of studies outsourced to the private sector or federally financed research and development sectors. And I know you're not completely impartial on this topic, but I was curious about your perspective.
Yeah, well, so I think, first off, I think in some ways it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Because, and I'll say, when I was in the Pentagon doing analysis, much of the analysis that we did, we sponsored, say, federally funded research and development centers to actually do the analysis. So it's not, it's not just us versus them, whoever the us and whoever the them is. I think it is, it's an ecosystem, first off. Second, I do think it's important to have independent analysis and independent looks at various things for many reasons, but including just to build credibility. So, you, Tom, talked about officials testifying before Congress. I think members are justifiably skeptical across administrations. This is a executive versus legislative branch thing. This is a constitutional thing, not a partisan thing. I think legislators are justifiably skeptical of members of the executive branch coming to testify about matters because they know that those folks come with talking points. And I think one of the things that's really struck me since coming to CSBA is the lack of resources that members of Congress, their staffs, committees have to make analytical judgments. CRS is a wonderful institution, but it pales in comparison to the analytical resources that the Defense Department services have. So I think there is an important role for outside independent organizations to inform that debate for the legislature, also for the executive.
Any other comments?
I would just add and build on that, and I agree. It's not an either or situation. It's a continuum, and I think there's certain variables that correlate, right? Inherently governmental functions, you're going to keep in house, and you might have outside analyses informed, but it's going to be tightly controlled. As you get further and further from inherently governmental functions and more broad and more strategic type questions, the aperture opens. Timeliness, you're going to use your in-house staff for the question has to be answered tomorrow. There's no time to call somebody. There's no time to set up a contract. There's no time to engage and have somebody else pay a fixed cost of learning. So, but the question that needs to be answered in a year and you want an independent view of, ideally suited. So you have in-house analytic capability, you have the very close touch federally funded research and development corporations, and you have the broader ecosystem beyond that. So it's not an either or, it's a continuum, and the situation and the requirements and the factors of an individual case place you in that spectrum.
Thank you.
I concur.
Okay, good. So we're going to go to Dakota Wood, who's with us in the auditorium here, and he's been monitoring and looking at the audience questions coming in and has got the best one teed up for first here. So Dakota.
Well, the conversation's actually addressed a number of them. One from Bill Soderberg really was, does all this need to be centralized as opposed to left to the services? But some of the discussion has gotten that. A related one was, how do you rationalize all these multiple incoming streams of data but you wanted different viewpoints on this thing. So I think that the one that then naturally flows from this comes from Matthew Stevens, and the question was, should defense industry be integrated into this analytic work about future force development and all? You know, that you've got this government versus industrial-based sort of thing. Is that letting them inside the wire, or is that a critical viewpoint and they should be involved in that decision-making analysis?
Good. And anyone want to take up first?
So I'll start, and then
Yeah,
I'll
please.
pass out. So here's a place where I think, it's particularly valuable for their input, and that is the government folks will make an assumption about what industry can and can't do and what is easy or hard for industry. But they're not in industry, right? They're not working with it. And so you can easily see how in building your plan, your assumption there is your weakest. And if you're dealing with folks in industry who say, you don't understand, changing that is actually a really long, hard process. This is quick. That's easy for us to do. Then all of a sudden you have a much better understanding of the realm that is possible, and it prevents you from the risk of only assuming the things you already know can be done. Whereas part of the strategic advantage of the United States over China or anyone else is our free market system and the innovation that comes from that, and being able to tap and understand from them the vision of what they see as the possible that the government isn't seeing really reduces a blind spot. So I'll pause and see what else you guys want to add.
I'll just add a few brief points and then turn it over. And it's already been said, in terms of the question of centralization and central direction, I would, competition among analysts is a good thing. That's already been said here, but it's worth repeating. So I think the fact that the services have robust analytic capability, that the OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense, has robust analytic capability, that think tanks and that others have robust analytic capability, and that sometimes they come to different answers, that's a good thing. That's helping decision makers wrestle with the different aspects of the problem. And in respect to industry, I would just add, elaborate even further on Secretary Norquist's points. I think, again, not central direction, but I think collaboration could be enhanced and improved. I think many of the companies in industry have very robust capabilities, and they have strategic rationales, right? They're trying to see where a program going, or seeing where a requirement or a mission is going, and get there. The skate to where the puck is going to be type of analogy for defense contractors. So they have specific reasons why it's in their interest to do it, but as part of doing that, they have incredible expertise, and they're creating incredible amounts of information, sometimes even closer to the technology than the DOD analysts are. So I think that's a latent capability out there that could be captured and could be used more effectively.
Yeah, another area is analytical tools, because I think defense industry, or parts of defense industry have some very good analytical tools that could be shared. And then finally, as, if you will, as users of some of the analytical scenarios that DOD uses. I think if you want to, if part of the idea here is to steer the ship and get the whole ship going on the same course and heading, you probably should share the scenarios that the Defense Department is using to make decisions. And at least in my experience, that's sometimes easier said than done.
Yeah, we have run against, as a think tank, we have a hard time understanding the DOD's scenario. So Dakota, back to you.
Yeah, we do have more. I mean, Stephen Hefner had mentioned about this multiple data sets, and you have all these players involved. And so then a question from Paul Mazel rolls right into that. What impact does newer technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence, what role does that have to play? Anything yet? Would it be in the future? And then is there a danger of handing it to a machine to come out with an answer and taking the people out of the loop? So just kind of these new technologies and how they relate to handling all this information.
I'll just start off with maybe a slightly different take on it, which is how do we portray new technologies and new processes in our analysis? So we're talking about costs. Right? We're talking about costs and operations and sustainment costs. Well, across a number of areas in defense industry, we're moving towards and into digital engineering, digital twinning. If the promise of that is realized, that should result in reduced costs across the life cycle of a particular weapon system. How much do we buy that? How much should we buy that? How are our assumptions there again, industrial age assumptions that maybe need to be updated. That's one example. And then you could, again, think about the value of information. Again, if you just get at the heart of much of what we've been doing in recent years, recent decades, it's all about the value of information. How do we portray the value of information in our analysis? I think those are big questions, and I think those are questions that are still need to be addressed in fundamental ways.
So just a couple of thoughts on this one. One is that you really have to be careful about transparency versus the black box. And so when you use artificial intelligence and others, if you run them and then the answer is 7 and no one knows why, you've lost 90% of the value of the analysis. So you really got to make sure that whatever tool you use is transparent about it. Now, one of the advantages of those is you can have AI systems play against each other. Imagine just use like a board game, like a war game. 2 people play each other, they're going to quickly fall into the ruts of their previous experience. You have AI systems play each other, they could produce outcomes that are completely unexpected. Then you can go back and go, why? Was it something wrong in the algorithm, or have they experimented with something that we didn't see was possible? Then the result is not the conclusion, but the learning about what is possible or not possible that then supports future analysis. The other angle to AI is, you talk about new technologies. Take AI and hypersonics. Hypersonics, I know the weight of the explosive I can put in it. All I know is I can go really fast. You can model that. You can envision that. It's like it isn't hard to experiment with the implications of that. AI will allow you to change what, how? It's not clear, right? And so it's almost impossible to envision how do I model effectively the effects of AI until I can see the breakthrough that it produces, either in readiness or accuracy or something else. So certain things lend themselves very easily to updating your analysis, and other ones introduce a wild card, and your thought is, I'm not sure how that's going to change it, because until we see its use, it's a big open space.
2 quick ones if we got time. One. Well, there's one for Secretary Whitley in particular. James Bexfield had asked about the importance of campaign models, which related to this issue of, opacity and what you can really see. But then Carly Goldenberg, specifically the Secretary, said, in what ways is decision support analysis linked to Army readiness? So you could see this blending of real-world modeling, a lot of analytic, and how does it actually affect the services in the real world?
Well, let me respond to Bex first. And I think I know where he is on this, so we'll see if he'll let me know afterwards if I get it wrong. That was part of the debate about 10 years ago, and what really led to, which was part of the motivating factors for what led to that atrophy, that divestiture of a lot of that capability. And the concern with campaign analysis in at least its form at that time was the intensity, the computational intensity, the labor intensity, the time it took to produce results. So the issue was, if I'm not going to produce things that are timely and responsive to a deputy secretary, if he needs to know something in a week, and it's going to take me 6 months to come up with an answer, why are we doing it? So I think the criticism, the concern was correct. The answer and what came next was perhaps not correct. So campaign analysis is a very important tool and has a very important role to play. And I think some of that's being rebuilt right now. But you can't over-rely on it, right? And we need to be able to, do very detailed campaign analysis, that's fine, but we also need to figure out how, and people are working on this, but we need to be able to figure out how to do things at a higher level that it can get you more rapid iterations and look at a broader swath of problems. And I don't know if that's technically called campaign analysis or if that's a variation that's not called campaign analysis, but it's something else. But that's what we need to integrate in addition to campaign analysis. With respect to the Army, I mean, I don't think the Army is unique in that respect, right? I mean, I think all of the department has a struggle analytically thinking about readiness. The department is not good at tying a resource level to a readiness level. The Army does not program readiness. The Army, the Department of Defense grows O&M accounts at inflation, operations and maintenance accounts at inflation. There is not a programmatic decision about what the investment should be in training, in depot overhauls, et cetera, and what readiness level that would deliver. I think that's a significant weakness, and I wouldn't take it too far. It's never going to be a precise science, but we're at the other end of the problem right now, which is we have virtually no, maybe exaggerating a little bit, but we have very little analytic capability to do that.
Thank you. So we're at the end of our time, or nearly there, and so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer a question. That is, if there was one thing that could be done to improve the quality of analysis in DOD decision-making, what would that be? And even more specifically, does Congress have a role in this? Because I have been told Congress is looking at this area, perhaps in this upcoming legislative session. And so what, in your thoughts, could be done in this area? I'll start with you, Secretary.
So first, I'd highlight that of all the things DOD spends its money on, the analysis is actually one of the least expensive, because it's a certain number of people getting labor costs, and if you can get right the mix between two munitions or between aircraft things, you've saved yourself enormous sums of money. And so I would make sure that we expand and look at the range of places where that analysis is not being applied, and be able to try and take advantage of it in additional places. We use it well in certain ones, but I think in some places we don't go there because we don't have the capability, and if we did, you'd be able to see some of the same rate of returns that you do here.
And I'm going to cop out a little bit and not offer solutions, but just highlight the problem space that we've already highlighted. I think that strategic analysis is that bridge between strategy to programming is the biggest analytic deficit in the department today, and so the biggest contribution moving forward is fixing that.
Thank you.
And I would agree, building off of that, and it's really, rebuilding that intellectual capital at the intersection of strategy, operations, and budgets.
Thank you very much. Well, as always, I always want more, and we never have enough time for it. I guess that's the way you should leave your audience, is wanting more versus feeling like they're too full. So what a great session. I'd like to thank our panelists, Secretary Norquist, Secretary Whitley, and Dr. Mankin for their insights. I want to thank our audience for sticking with us and joining us, and thank you for your questions. If you work on the Hill or in a think tank or just have other questions, please reach out to us. We'll give you our contact information at the end, and we'd love to keep talking about this. At the end, in a little bit, you'll get a survey asking us how we did, and we'd appreciate your candid feedback on that. You will be able to find this program in its entirety posted on the heritage.org website as well as on YouTube, probably in a day or so. But for the meanwhile, let's keep the Ukrainians in our thoughts and prayers, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Here's the music, the sound, the cameras.
Yeah.